Hey AP Literature, I'm just going to tell you now, strap in because this lesson's going to be a little bit of a doozy. I wish we could do it in person, but we can't. But you don't really have too much work to do today. I just want you to understand, to hear what I'm saying, to understand what I'm saying, to check out the different handouts and readings that I'm going to provide for you, just to kind of get a sense of what's going on so that come Monday you can look at 1984 or, in Isaac's case, your summer reading book um, through a couple of these critical lenses. So, okay, let's talk about literary criticism. Also, say hello to Gobi. Gobi. Yes, he says hello. He wanted to say hi to everybody and hang out with me while I taught. So, here we are. Okay, so what is literary criticism? I'll bet that the first thing you think of when you hear criticism is that negative connotation, ordinary, everyday, like a critic is a grump who exists to find problems and expose faults. That is not literary criticism. And I want you to think when we talk literary criticism, not the negative connotations of the word criticism, but rather the Greek root of the word criticism, which is kritikos. It's a Greek verb meaning to make a discernment, to distinguish, to decide, or to judge. So the original sense of the word critic is a person who expresses a reasoned opinion about the meaning, value, truth, beauty, or craft of something. And that's what we're going to be doing, is expressing our meaningful, reasoned, valuable opinions. That's literary criticism, okay? So what does that mean we're going to be doing with the texts? Specifically, we're going to be interpreting, analyzing, and evaluating works of literature. Now, literature is usually writing that has lasted because it deals with timeless ideas and universal interests. Now, some classic literature you might be saying, how can this be of universal interest if I was bored out of my mind reading it? Well, sometimes the writing style isn't exactly as engaging as we might hope, especially with what we're used to nowadays, but the ideas that it deals with, those are the timeless thoughts. When we interpret a work, we talk about one or more of its possible meanings, right? So literary interpretation sharpens critical thinking skills. How do we interpret now? How might they have interpreted then? What is one possible meaning? What's another possible meaning? Things like that. When we analyze a work, it's kind of like opening up the hood of a car to see how the engine works. It's technical. We pull things apart. We examine our relationships, not just what a poem means, but how it means that. How did Poe make the raven so creepy? Things like that. That's literary analysis. And then lastly, we have evaluation. That's when we form personal judgments. So even though we're writing in third person all year, it's all personal judgments. It can be as simple as, was I interested or was I bored? Was I captured? Did I feel trapped? What value for me does it have? What value for society? All sorts of, what insights are there? That's literary evaluation. Literary criticism lumps all of those things together, the interpretation, the analysis, and the evaluation. Now, there's three principles that we're going to operate while we are literary critics. First is that we're just going to be doing it, right? So a lot of discussion, a lot of bouncing ideas, a lot of iron sharpening iron, independent thinking, that's going to be the goal. Second thing is going to be that we're going to try and expose you to a variety of perspectives, some of which you're going to agree with, some of which you're going to disagree with, and that's okay. Some of which you're going to understand immediately, some you're not, and that's okay too. But thirdly, even though we're looking at these things with a critical eye, we don't want to take away from the joy and the pleasure of reading the stories, right? So we're going to build on this rigor. We're going to dive in. We're going to get interested, but we're not going to beat things to death, right? We're not going to destroy the joy in the reading, hopefully, by talking about it all, okay? So that's literary criticism. Now, let's talk about critical lenses for a moment. What is a lens? Well, when we're reading a work of literature, sometimes it's hard to try and pick out everything all at once. It was kind of like when we were looking at The Story of an Hour when I said look for character, look for setting, look her point of view, things like that. It's almost like saying, read through the whole thing just like a character. Read through the whole thing just like that setting. It's isolating aspects of the text so that we can gain deeper meaning about an aspect of it. Sometimes we read through a lens that sort of allows us to ignore hidden meanings and focus on the enjoyment. Sometimes we read through a lens that's going to think of it kind of like 3D glasses, right? You can see things that you couldn't see before, and that's what the psychological, the gender, all of those lenses are going to allow us to do. Okay, so let's talk about some lenses. First of all, we've got archetypal criticism. Archetype signifies narrative designs, character types, images that are identifiable. They could be mythological, they could be dreams, ritualized modes of social behavior. There's archetypal similarities within diverse phenomena, and those archetypal similarities often reflect universal truths, primitive concepts, elemental patterns, and this can embody and evoke a profound response. For example, the theme of death and rebirth, right? That is the archetype of archetypes. You've got other archetypal, so the hero's journey or the journey under the ground, heavenly ascent, the search for one's father, paradise and Hades image, so heaven and hell, rebel hero, such as Prometheus, the scapegoat, the fatal woman. All of those are archetypes, and when we read through a lens of archetypal criticism, we're looking at narrative designs and what they evoke. Then there's gender and feminist criticism. A feminist critic sees cultural and economic disabilities in a patriarchal society as hindering or preventing women from realizing creative possibilities. A lot of literature contains these aspects, right? You've got man dominating subject. And so if you are looking at it through a gender lens, you're going to assume a couple things. One, the civilization is patriarchal, pervasively patriarchal. Two, the concepts of gender are these cultural constructs that are affected by patriarchal biases. So the concept that men and women have to have different roles is a social construct, but it negatively affects one gender and positively affects another. And then third, the patriarchal ideology shows itself in writings. Now, sometimes when we're going to look at how a patriarchal society that was designed in the literature is affecting the woman. Sometimes we're going to look at the author's patriarchal society that they were living in and how that pervades in through the literature. Now, this is similar to Marxist, which we'll talk about in a moment, but instead of focusing on relationships between classes, it's going to focus on relationships between genders. So you're going to look at patterns of thought, behavior, values, patterns in relationships, and power within relationships between the sexes, okay? So that's going to be your gender criticism. Then we have social or Marxist criticism. This is not standing here and saying we're going to look for communism in literature. Not at all. A social or Marxist critic specifically looks at economic and cultural theory and how social classes are interacting within the literature. So the evolving history of humanity and its ways of thinking are determined by changing modes of material production. Yeah, historical changes in this method of production allow for these social changes in terms of power and social class. Not power within genders or between genders, but power between the haves and the have-nots and things like that. And then also Marxist critic looks at ideology, concepts, beliefs, values, what is important, where does the power lie? That's going to be more of your Marxist criticism. It's a lot of who has the money, who has the power, who does not, and what happens as a result, right? Okay, so that's social and Marxist. Then we've got new criticism. New criticism is directed basically against lives, psychology of authors. And so new criticism basically says, forget the authors. Let's just look at the poem or the work. It's independent of its author. So new criticism doesn't distinguish between genres. It's very verbal, talks about the literature itself. It completely ignores the human element of the creation of the literature. Talks about the literature's existing as its own, it's independent, it's self-sufficient. And so it's all within a work. The analysis of complexities is all within a work in new criticism. So that's new. Then we have psychological, psychoanalytical. This primarily deals with literature as an expression of the state of mind, feelings, desires of the author. So the assumption is this is the polar opposite of new criticism, because the assumption is that the author's personality can be used to explain and interpret the literary work. Or the mode of reading a literary work is experiencing the consciousness of the author. So this allows us to investigate the psychology of a character and the psychology of an author to figure out the meaning of the text. Yeah. So that's when you don't just have to look at the psychology of the author, but you are looking at the psychology, psychoanalytical, the state of mind, feelings, desires, both of the characters and of the authors, why they're in there, how they're in there, things like that. So that's psychological. Then we have reader response. This focuses on you, the reader actively reading the work of literature. This turns from the traditional concept of work is a structure of meanings, and now it shifts the perspective to the activity going on in the reader's mind while it's being read. So it asks what features of the work, such as narrator, plot, character, style, structure, is less important than the connection between the experience and the text. This is something that we often do as students, especially in earlier grade levels. Basically, if you're doing reader response, you are deciding that literature has no objective meaning. There is no meaning of the work. It exists for you, your relationship, what it evokes within you as you are reading it. That's reader response. Now, we've got 3 more. You're hanging in there, great. You can pause this video at any time to kind of sit and absorb what you've heard. Now, we have new historicism, not to be confused with historical, but new historicism asks us to consider literature in a very wide context. So, first, let's talk about historical criticism. Historical criticism talks about the time period during which the author wrote it, right? So history, the social, political, economic, cultural, intellectual climate at the time. So if you're interpreting William Faulkner, you would think about the fact that he wrote most of his stuff during and after World War II, which helps explain the feeling of darkness, defeat, and the struggle that's in pretty much all of his writing, because he was writing it during and after World War II. Then when we go to new historicism, this places it in a wider context. So new historicism doesn't just say what was happening when this was written, but it says, what is our understanding of what was happening when this was written? So it's not enough for new historicism just to understand the socio-cultural and the historical context, but also understanding where we are right now and how that impacts our understanding of the socio-cultural and historical context. For example, the questions that we ask about women in Shakespeare's plays are shaped by our contemporary thoughts about women. So that means you have to account for the fact that our questions asking about women in Shakespeare are currently impacted by what's going on in our lives. It's a bit of a existential lens. And it's more of an extra jumping off from historical criticism. But it's very interesting because it doesn't just say what was happening, but it says, what's my opinion on what was happening? To put it very, very simply. Okay? And then lastly, we have deconstructionist criticism. Deconstruction is the most ethereal one of all of them. It was developed by some very unconventional people who basically said that literature means nothing because language means nothing, and because we can't know the meaning of what's going on, and so there's no way of knowing what the meaning is. So it's very existential, complicated, basically says we can't understand the meaning because language means nothing. We're not going to hit that one so much in this class, okay? So those are your big ones. I'm going to, you're going to have a reading of just the sampling, which is what I told you about. Then you're also going to have these literary theory cards, which kind of help think about what you're coming from. Now, you'll see biographical. Biographical is a lot like psychological, but it really focuses on the author. So psychological could be focusing about on the character or the author, but biographical is all about, biographical kind of combines historic, psychological, all of that. So you'll get these little cards. They look kind of like this. They have some helpful thoughts and questions whenever you're trying to approach something. So as you approach your summer book with one of these lenses, which we'll go over how to in a minute, your cards are going to help you think about what questions to ask and what things to focus on. Okay? So what does this look like applied to something? Well, we are going to start off by applying it to maybe an easier medium than advanced literature. We are going to look at Taylor Swift's music video, Wildest Dreams. Okay? So you can go in the mini lesson PowerPoint that is attached to all of this and click on the link to Wildest Dreams, or you can just YouTube it. But at this time, pause this video and go watch Wildest Dreams. And in the back of your mind, think about post-colonial perspectives, which we talked about a bit before. So post-colonial, briefly to cover that one because that's not so much in the overview. Post-colonial talks about impacts on places after modern colonization. So consequences of control and exploitation. So post-colonial usually focuses on Africa, but not always because plenty of other places have been colonized, but mostly by Europeans. So post-colonial is really focusing on human consequences of human control and exploitation. So as you're watching Wildest Dreams, think about the historic elements, think about post-colonial elements, and think about gender elements. So pause the video, watch Wildest Dreams, and then come back right here. Okay, I'm assuming that you have now watched Wildest Dreams. Now let's talk about a few of these. So consider the time period and the place described and how a writer's life can affect the way that it's written. So when you're looking at it through the historical lens, we're saying, what does this text or this video say about a particular time and place? Okay, so how might someone living in that time and place understand the text as well? That's another aspect of historical criticism. How might someone in the day and age when the author wrote it interpret the text? Gender is the conventional, traditional roles, and of course how men or women might reject, protest, or try and change them. And post-colonial, again, kind of like we talked about, it's that how characters, events, and themes reinforce our understandings of cultural identity. So, as you are watching Wildest Dreams, some interesting things to think of. And we would have this as a discussion, but unfortunately we can't. So, gender lens. Let's talk about gender for a little bit. In this video, there's a major focus on her appearance. Two women are the ones helping her. Women usually are the ones focused more on appearance. The outfits are very colonial in terms of British safari. All the men in there are very muscular and rugged. The man is the one initiating all of the physical contact and has control on her and shows that by his hand on her face. That's very controlling. Now, after Taylor Swift pushes him away, he makes the crazy symbol, reinforcing that gender stereotype that women are the crazy ones, right? Women are emotional, and that therefore makes them crazy, right? Additionally, Taylor Swift is wearing more revealing clothing while sitting in Wild Animals, portraying this damsel in distress trope that's a little archetypal. And mainly the men are always the manly men. They're smoking cigarettes, they're looking at women. So a lot of these, like this video plays to so many specific gender things. So we could look at the video saying, what is it saying about gender? What is it reinforcing or what is it changing? Now, to talk historically, it really looks like it's the golden age of movies, right? 1940s, 1950s. Taylor Swift is made to look like a pinup, which would have been very popular in that time. Now note, it's pretty much mostly white actors, which also dominated that 40s, 50s time, which she's portraying using her dress. The clothes people are wearing are old-fashioned. The biplane is in there. It's very historic. And actually, you see Scott Eastwood in there, who's Clint Eastwood's son. And Clint Eastwood, of course, is old Hollywood. Yeah. So there's a lot of historical things that were thrown in there. Why? What message were those things sending, right? Why were they in there? Food for thought. And lastly, let's talk post-colonial. So the video seems to be set in Africa, but there's not a single person who's clearly from Africa in that video, especially because the video seems to be set in Central Africa, and we do not see any of those people represented in the video. Therefore, you see Africa being exploited for its natural resources, its beauty, its landscape, but what are those things being used as a backdrop for? White actors, right? So post-colonial lens says, notice the exploitation of the African land with the lack of representation or credit to African people. Additionally, the choice to wear colonial attire could be seen as very easily through a post-colonial lens, romanticizing colonialism. So why was this done? Additionally, there's no reference to indigenous culture. There's no specificity because, of course, there's so many of these cultures represented in Africa, and there's none of that included in this video. Okay, and so maybe if you want, go back, watch it again, keeping that chart in mind, and think about all those little things that are in there now that we're viewing it from a critical standpoint using these lenses instead of just watching it for fun. Okay, so that's an example of looking at a simpler medium through literary criticism, but what does it look like applied to a book? So briefly, let's talk about Romeo and Juliet, which I know we're all familiar with, okay? So let's say we were to take a feminist or gender approach to Romeo and Juliet. First of all, there is so much misogyny, which is negative attitudes about women, exposed in this piece. If we were looking at Romeo and Juliet through a gender or feminist lens, we would ask questions like, how does Juliet view the prospect of marriage before Romeo versus after? Before meeting Romeo, how does Juliet react to the fact that her parents are going to choose who she marries? Also, how does Juliet's dad feel, or how does he think she's going to react when he basically tells her, hey, you've got a husband and here's when you're getting married, right? Think about that. Then what is the relationship between disobedience and death? So what is that like, and which genders does it affect? And then when Juliet is attempting to make amends with her parents, what does she regret? She regrets her disobedient opposition in terms of marriage, right? So much of this story is about gender and power between the genders. That's what the feminist lens suggests. Then let's look at a psychoanalytical lens. If we are looking at the psychoanalytical lens for Romeo and Juliet, we're going to ask things such as, do any characters perform incredibly uncharacteristic actions? Why? What do those mean? What are the inner conflicts between the characters? How are they revealed? How are they dealt with? How are they resolved? What does this suggest about how externally these conflicts should be resolved? It also asks us to compare the language used to describe Romeo's love for Rosalind with the language used to describe his love for Romeo and Juliet. What are those differences? Why are there differences? Also, the connection between love and hate and those psychological implications, particularly for your titular characters, Romeo and Juliet, right? And then, of course, you can look at Freudian concepts such as the id, the ego, the superego, how that relates to adolescence, because, of course, Romeo and Juliet are both teenagers, right? And Juliet's barely a teenager. So if we were looking at Romeo and Juliet through a psychological lens, we would focus on those questions and, of course, then try and answer them. Lastly, if we're looking at Romeo and Juliet through the archetypal approach, we're going to ask things like, does Romeo stand apart from people who he's socially equal to, such as Mercutio and Benvolio? If yes, how? How does Romeo's quest for love mirror his quest for self-identity or self-fulfillment? What is the significance of Romeo's exile from Verona? What progress does his death bring? How does society react to his life and his death? And then also talking about Juliet, like what differentiates Juliet from other females in the play? So again, we're talking about these archetypes, talking about what Romeo and Juliet represent, what universal truths there are represented in this play, things like that, okay? So those are going to be things that we would talk about if we were applying some of these lenses to Romeo and Juliet. So now what you're going to do on Monday, because really understanding this is your job for today, or maybe not even understanding, just getting a general grasp of this is your job for today. On Monday, there's a worksheet. You can either make a copy and complete it on Google Docs, or you could print it, or you could answer the questions on a separate piece of paper. Any of those things are fine. But you're going to choose two lenses, they could be any lens, to apply to 1984. I have a pretty good guess on the two that you're going to pick, but there's lots of options for you to choose from. Okay, and so you can pick any two lenses for 1984 or Isaac for your book, and there's some guiding questions to help you think about your story in a new way. Okay, you can use those literary cards that are going to be on Google Classroom to kind of help think of starting points and questions, and we're going to go from there. All right, so that's your big thing for Monday, is going to be going over viewing your texts through different lenses, and then we're going to spend a lot more time on this next week. Also, your job for Monday is to pick an independent reading book. Up on Google Classroom, there's a list of all the books that have ever been on the AP exam. You can pick any of them. You can pick one of the 600-page ones, or you can pick one of the 100-page ones. I don't care. Just pick one of the ones that you think you're going to enjoy, and we'll go from there. And there will be an assignment posted later next week that's going to be your independent reading assignment. It's not going to be too long. It's not a paper. It's practice analyzing, things like that. Okay, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I am going to have office hours later today if you need, and of course my email is always available for you. So I'm looking forward to seeing you guys again next week. Hopefully today is the last day we do this. I hope you're having a good day, and yeah, can't wait to see you. Have a good one, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.